Welcome everyone to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. Today we're going to talk about Saagar and Jetty and a piece that was written by Alan McLeod on MintPress News. And I just want to remind people that I've been talking and warning people about Crystal and Saagar, not telling people to unsubscribe. Like, you can watch my original videos when I would talk about the Hills of Rising and remind people about how they're corporate news. And that was the point, is just to keep that in mind and how that can influence some of their talking points. Lo and behold, eventually, we get articles like this that Alan McLeod just released, pointing out some of the State Department talking points that Saagar and Jetty says about countries like China, as well as his past, and how we need to consider Saagar and Jetty's past and how that influences his talking points today. I've made videos about Crystal Ball, and her pact that Crystal started was People's House Project, and that was funded by Reid Hoffman and New Knowledge. New Knowledge was caught creating fake accounts online to promote the Russiagate narrative. I also question whether this may have influenced some of her talking points, such as in this clip that we're about to see right here, in which Jimmy Dore also catches.
So that's just
Greenwald, who thinks this was all ridiculous.
Okay, so here's the bad part. Here's the part where she loses the plot. Just for a little bit. Watch this.
Now look, I am not like a Glenn Greenwald who thinks this was all ridiculous and the Trump campaign did nothing nefarious vis-a-vis Russia. The president's team clearly sought to work with Russia.
So that's just some blanket assertion she puts out about Glenn Greenwald. She doesn't specifically say what you disagree with about Glenn. She just talks in broad generalities. Watch this. It's kind of bullshit. But this is what I mean. She has to first genuflect at the altar of Russiagate before she can go on and debunk it.
Now look, I am not like a Glenn Greenwald who thinks this was all ridiculous and that the Trump campaign did nothing nefarious vis-a-vis Russia. The president's team clearly sought to work with Russia. They used Russian illegal activity to their own benefit, and then they lied about the whole mess to try to cover it up.
And that's why nobody was indicted. That's why after 2 investigations, 22 months by Mueller, not a fucking shred of evidence to support anything you just said. Isn't that weird? She's about to fucking wag her finger at people for covering Russiagate poorly and hyping it. And before she does it, she has to first affirm that Russiagate's real, even though it's not. Isn't that weird?
Those were the 3 Hail Marys, dude. I mean, that's like...
Not only that, guys, but take a look at this, and they have still, Crystal and Saagar have still not apologized for laughing at Julian Assange's suffering and the misinformation that they presented about what happened in the embassy, which was long debunked already by credible sources. Take a look at this.
And so we accidentally learned that Julian Assange has been indicted.
So not only that, we might have actually just complicated a very, very fractious diplomacy that's going on right now, because there is a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiations going on between the U.S., the U.K., and Ecuador. Ecuador is completely sick of Julian Assange. They want them to get the heck out of there.
They want him out, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's to the point where...
He's been there for 6 years.
Not only is that, but Julian refuses to clean up his cat's litter box. He is like... Like in court filings, they're having major lawsuits against each other because Julian refuses to clean his room. He's a grown man. He's like in his 40s, and the man will not clean his room and clean up after his cat. He also refuses to shower more than once a week.
What?
Yeah, it's disgusting. Like, so...
I'm glad you're on, because I didn't know any of those details, and they're important.
Everybody should read this story. But there's some more here. So the U.S. announced sanctions.
I quite frankly don't understand why this isn't more viral, like this clip, because Crystal and Saagar seriously owe Julian Assange and everybody who's fighting to free Assange an apology. Julian Assange is in prison right now for telling the truth about U.S. war crimes. And these guys are laughing about his suffering, laughing about misinformation, and then when they were corrected on it, they did not apologize. Now, I haven't watched Rising in many, many months, and I haven't watched Breaking Points at all. So seeing some of the clips that Alan McLeod posts on his article here, I rewatched them, and then I noticed some subtle State Department talking points that I had not noticed when I used to watch the Hills, the Rising, which we're going to get into, and I'm going to, show you guys some of these more subtle State Department talking points that they say. And, people are talking now about how the Rising is unwatchable, like with the new hosts, and how they're just really they give a lot of indoctrinated talking points. One of the hosts didn't even know the role that the Soviet Union played in World War II and how significant that was. So it's more apparent now with these new hosts, but with Crystal and Saagar's charismatic personality and how they say the right things sometimes, it's harder to pinpoint some of those State Department talking points that they say. So let's take a look a little bit into what Alan MacLeod said here. Primarily, some of the things that he criticizes Saagar and Jetty for saying are some of the State Department talking points that he says against China. And this is dangerous because this increases foreign tensions. I went over with Caleb Maupin on my show the other day when we went over this Tim Pool clip about how the script has flipped with a lot of these conservatives, and now they're Russiagating, except with China. So it appears that Saagar and Jetty may be doing the same thing. So here's the article. It's called Saagar and Jetty, the Pseudo-Populist Mainlining Neocon's Ideas into Progressive Politics. While he is undeniably charismatic and confident host, Saagar and Jetty's shtick is remarkably similar to that of his former employer, Tucker Carlson, who also rails against elites while being one of them. Now that's the thing, right? Some people like Tucker, they point out some of these inconsistencies that the liberal mainstream media says when it comes to Russiagate or when it comes to some issues in foreign policy. But then they go on to say some things about the culture war in America and give some anti-communist talking points. And that right there, people, is what a limited hangout is. You give people some truths, but then you give them some narrative that supports the empire, but not, the actual truth. Now, Alan MacLeod points out he lays out why it's important to call out some of these pundits, because a lot of people trust them. That's why. A lot of people trust them. And he points out here how Breaking Points, the new podcast that Crystal and Saagar had just started, which is now they're independent. They're not working for any corporation. But still, even if you're an independent news, you can still repeat a lot of State Department talking points. Case in point, people like Mike Figueredo of the Humanist Report and David Dole of the Rational National, as well as bread tubers like Vosh. I mean, those people I just mentioned are pro-censorship, which is, that's something that the State Department favors. Vosh, for example, also repeats a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric, and Vosh repeats a lot of anti-Russia and anti-Syria narratives. So he points out, Alan MacLeod, Breaking Points is effectively a copy of Rising, and Jetty and Ball's show on the Hill, Rising, had the look and tone of a cable news show with two well-presented and attractive hosts chatting to guests in a brightly lit studio, but it had far more substance, featuring stories and points of views that are completely ignored in the rest of corporate media. The two invited on a range of informative guests, the caliber of whom is simply not found on cable news. Thus, it had a jarringly subversive quality that appealed to viewers, as if the two were smuggling forbidden but increasingly popular ideas, all while maintaining a polished corporate feel. Now, we know why a lot of leftists appreciate Crystal Ball is because she supported Bernie Sanders and she presents herself as a progressive and says the right things sometimes. But the key appeal that he points out about Saagar is that it is convincing progressive audiences that although a conservative, he is still a political outsider with views not too dissimilar from their own, yet a look into Enjeti's background and professional career suggests otherwise, that he is very much an insider and is pulling a similar trick to so many Republicans of late who are rebranding as anti-elite, anti-deep state warriors, all the while maintaining some highly problematic viewpoints to his audience. Now he goes into Saagar's background here. A neocon in the making. Before becoming a populist media personality, Enjeti appeared to be training for the role of deep state official, pursuing an undergraduate degree at George Washington University and a master's degree in security studies at Georgetown University, both DC area colleges well known for their connections to the national security state. Enjeti also decided to study counterterrorism studies at the Israeli University IDC Herzliya. Situated on a former military base, the university's board boasts a former head of Mossad and ex-Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Meanwhile, its international advisory board is replete with U.S. national security leaders such as Robert Hutchings, former chairman of the National Intelligence Council, Stephen Peter Rosen, one-time director of political military affairs as the White House National Security Council, and an ex-CIA chief R. James Woolsey. Here's why that master's program is problematic. The master's program in counterterrorism studies, and I mean, again, if it's funded by DC, it's going to indoctrinate people about why it's okay to have regime change wars in these countries and not respect the sovereignty of those countries. The master's program in counterterrorism studies features modules in profiling terrorist strategy and deterrence, Arab language, Iranian studies, and a course called Hezbollah, a hybrid terrorist organization. This is an institution that trains Israeli and American intelligence officials, not radical populist outsiders. I mean, unless Saagar saw through it, right? Unless he saw through the State Department narratives that these institutions tried to indoctrinate him with, and he broke out of it. However, in his show, which McLeod goes over, Saagar repeats a lot of State Department talking points against China. All right, and then in some clips that I'm going to show, he also doesn't call out some State Department talking points, subtle State Department talking points that Crystal Ball and other guests from The Rising repeat about countries like Syria. Who remembers this clip here? I love seeing how they just immediately shut down this guy right here for trying to call Tulsi Gabbard a Russian asset. However, there are some things there that are still, pro-State Department. Let's watch this clip and I'll break it down here. This was back in November 2019.
Is engaging online. We know from the viewers of this show that a lot of Tulsi Gabbard support, a lot of Andrew Yang's support is within the online community.
Sure.
So that's not surprising to see that. At the same time, yes, Republicans want to support Tulsi Gabbard because she's going to be more favorable to Russia.
No,
Full
that is,
clap.
no.
Oh my God. What?
You're gonna pull that on this show?
It's good that they shut that down.
And I just want to be clear, these aren't the top line numbers.
Yeah.
This
No,
is
correct.
just
This is
within
on that
the
issue of
Trump,
Trump.
Trump
Right.
crossover voters.
Which doesn't surprise. It does not surprise me.
It's not about Russia. It's about the fact she's talking about ending endless
Anti-war.
wars. That's exactly what Trump ran on. That's what America First is.
It's not surprising that would have crossover appeal. The message of we've been fighting wars for 20. Wait, do you actually think that isn't a crossover message?
Yeah.
I don't.
Poll, but do you not think?
80% of the country is like, let's get out of Afghanistan.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
But the way Tulsi Gabbard wants to do that is putting our troops in harm's way.
How?
How?
When you look at her Syria plan, right? She's going to meet with Assad. When you're looking at meeting with dictators, that's just as bad as Trump meeting
Andrew,
with the Turkish president yesterday.
Let me ask you this: Did you support the Iraq War or not?
No.
No.
Yeah.
So me neither. And if you don't support the Iraq War, what that means is that you believe Saddam Hussein, a brutal dictator who gassed his own people, should have remained in charge of that country. That is my position. That's Tulsi's
That
position.
doesn't mean
and
that
that's
I would
also
go-
her position in Syria. And her view is, and look, you don't have to agree with the view, but the view is you've got three choices. You can go to war, you can ignore, or you can engage diplomatically. She believes in engaging diplomatically, even with people who are awful, murdering, brutal dictators.
That right there, that Crystal just did, it's good that she shut down what that guy was saying about how she's like a Russian asset and how she shouldn't meet with these leaders. But then she goes on to agree that Assad is a brutal dictator and that Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, not that these people were democratically elected by their country's people. That's not to say that these people are perfect, but to call them dictators, that just manufactures consent to some degree for intervention.
So look, you cannot think that that's the right approach. I think it's complicated, but you can't pretend that this isn't a principled view that she has consistently held in spite of the fact that she has been smeared by everyone at every turn.
I'm not saying it's not her long-standing view, right? I just don't think it keeps us safe.
I need to jump in.
Okay, but that's, yeah, go ahead.
Just to jump in here real quick. Look, I don't think Tulsi should have met with Assad either.
Yeah.
That being said, I think
You
it's
see
dangerous.
that? And then, all right. You guys heard that, right? Let me go back a little bit. He said, I don't think that Tulsi Gabbard should have met with Assad either. So what?
Met with Assad either.
Yeah.
That being said,
And Saagar says, yeah. And then he just stood by as Crystal and, everybody else was calling Assad a brutal dictator. Just sat there and agreed. He didn't shut it down. So that right there, that's misinformation. So McLeod goes on to talk about how after Saagar and Jetty's master's program, after his university studies, he goes on to study some war even more. So here he says, while still in university, Enjeti landed a job at the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, writing policy briefs about the conflict in Afghanistan and analyzing the moves and the strength of the Taliban. The ISW is a notoriously hawkish think tank funded by weapons contractors like Raytheon, General Dynamics, and DynCorp. Its board filled with retired generals and infamous neoconservative warmongers like Bill Kristol. Robbie Martin, a filmmaker whose movie series A Very Heavy Agenda deals with the rise of neoconservatives, told MintPress News about this misgivings. The Institute for the Study of War is one of the most enmeshed DC think tanks in terms of active military policy with the U.S. government. It is probably the most influential military-centric think tank in Washington. It's always encouraging war, which should be obvious by its name. ISW officials were at the wheel in the drive towards war in Iraq and have since called for more aggressive actions in Syria and other nations. And I just showed you how in The Rising, some of those talking points that can manufacture people's consent for war are more subtle. Just moving a little bit more down in the article, McLeod mentions that from the ISW, Enjeti later moved to the Hudson Institute, an equally neoconservative and pro-Iraq war think tank, where he worked as a media fellow until last year. Like the ISW, Hudson takes money from a cavalcade of weapons manufacturers, including Raytheon, Northrop, Grumman, and Lockheed Martin. The Hudson Institute is a standard bearer for establishment republicanism, as can be seen by a mere glance at its senior figures. Hudson's president and CEO, John P. Walters, is a longtime Republican official serving, among other roles, as George W. Bush's drug czar. Its senior vice president is Scooter Libby, Vice President Dick Cheney's chief of staff. As soon as he left office earlier this year, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also walked into a senior position at the organization. Now here, McLeod points out something interesting. Enjeti presents himself as an anti-war populist. The entire reason I am interested in politics is because of 9/11 and opposition to the war in Iraq. It is my North Star and always will be. He said in a recent episode of Rising, but this is difficult to square with the fact that he chose to study counterterrorism in Israel and to work for two of the most hawkish neoconservative think tanks in America. The very same think tanks whose principles laid the groundwork for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that Enjeti claims so vociferously to oppose. That an anti-war outsider could choose to work for the likes of the Kagan family does not compute. Now, he could have figured this out later on, but I mean, he's claiming that he was always opposed to the Iraq war. I mean, did he just find out later, or he just... I don't understand. You know, to me, it doesn't make sense, but maybe you guys in the comment section can let me know. Now here, McLeod details, you know, the Hudson Institute, how it has an obsession for China. And then McLeod links to an article that I reported here on this show when I had Marcus Cage and Ali Alexander on this show about how a Taiwanese think tank funds the Hudson Institute and other institutes in the U.S., which with the motivation and the goal of pushing for war with China. Now here's where we take a look at, you know, some of the things that Saagar and Jetty is saying about China. So it says, many critics have argued that the economic populism cannot be conservative and that right-wing populist variants attempt to unite a majority around issues of religion, as in Modi's India, or race, as in Nazi Germany, deflecting popular frustration downward and using minorities as scapegoats for the country's problems. And Jetty has tried to square the circle of raging against the elites while leaving the system in place by blaming so many of America's failings on China. Combining populist rhetoric with Hudson-style foreign policy. In a populist guide to 2020, he claims that the malaise the country is in can be explained as in no small part due to China's economic warfare. The bad guys in Enjeti's story of American corporations relocating eastward to use exploited Asian workers are not the corporations themselves, nor the US government, but the Chinese Communist Party, deviously convincing businesses to do so, a classic bait and switch maneuver. Corporations and the billionaire class sold us all out a very long time ago, he states, sounding like Bernie Sanders, before claiming that doing business with China is akin to American monopolies' tacit cooperation with the Nazi regime before the outbreak of World War II. He concludes, the people who control our banks, who control what we see, what we laugh at, who we watch play sports, are all now beholden to some very bad people in Beijing. And Beijing isn't shy about using its economic entanglements with us to try and force American citizens to behave however they'd like. Doesn't this sound like, oh my gosh, the Russians with their memes, they're trying to control what Americans think. Isn't that some Rachel Maddow thing, but with China? This is what Tim Pool was doing in that video that I was critiquing when I had Caleb Maupin on the show. As if the US doesn't have control over what people say on the internet right now, which is why I'm banned right now from Twitter for 4 more days. And how this channel, as well as some of my colleagues' channels, like the Combo Couch, Nico House, Jamal Thomas, we all got demonetized because they don't like the things that we say on this channel that goes against the empire, the US empire. So it sounds outlandish to me that these elites that control big tech, that control Wall Street, that control big pharma, that these elites are being controlled by China, even though the US is trying to gain control over all these regions before China does. It just doesn't make sense to me at all. In early 2020, Enjeti delighted in using the racist term the China virus for COVID-19, telling rising viewers that it is the height of cynical political correctness to get outraged at it. In a long soliloquy about wrestler John Cena correcting his inaccurate statement that Taiwan is an independent country, Enjeti again tried to launder aggression against China as a progressive position. The elites of this country do not work for us, do not really like us, and are completely for sale, he roared. For sale to whom? Not to the likes of Jeff Bezos, the government, or giant corporate interests, but to the authoritarian and cultish Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese have achieved total victory, he exclaimed. They are able to control the very speech that comes out of the most powerful people in America's mouth. That Cena, an American, would apologize for such a huge faux pas, akin to traveling to Kiev to announce Ukraine is forever Russia, is seen only as more proof that the U.S. is secretly under Chinese control. Undisclosed in all of this is the gigantic conflict of interest inherent in the fact that Enjeti's salary at the Hudson Institute came courtesy of piles of cash donated by the Taiwanese Foreign Ministry. As soon as Joe Biden won the election, Enjeti was warning that he was secretly a Chinese asset and using full populist language to do so. Big business is wholly in bed with the Chinese Communist Party. He explained, warning that China will use Wall Street to control Joe Biden, as if the president of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, is a mere puppet of a foreign country halfway around the globe. He also praised Donald Trump for changing the conversation about China. Earlier, Enjeti had tarred Democratic presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg with the same brush in a segment entitled, "Is Mike Bloomberg a Chinese Asset?" He condemned Bloomberg News for supposedly kowtowing to the Chinese regime and covering up the crimes of the Chinese elite. You see how this is similar to Russiagate? Like, oh my gosh, Donald Trump is being controlled by Russia. Oh my God, Joe Biden is being controlled by China. It's absolutely ridiculous. No, look at who's actually controlling them. It's the predator class here in this country that's controlling these presidents. These elites want to gain control of other countries to take resources from them so that they can enrich themselves and exploit the people in other countries. What I want you guys to take away from this video is this isn't me telling you guys that we shouldn't listen to or talk to any conservatives or unite with anybody who's a Republican or former Republican or libertarian. Like, I'm not telling you guys to not do that. What I'm telling you guys is to be wary of people, pundits, who repeat State Department talking points, whether they present themselves as liberal, progressive, or conservative. At the end of the day, even though Crystal Ball and Saagar and Jetty criticize the Democratic and Republican Party, what solutions are they offering us? At the end of the day, it seems like they still tell us to work within this system. There's no focus of direct action in their videos. There's no focus of opting out of the system. They talk about the problems of the country and then they criticize the Democratic and Republican Party, but then they repeat very subtly and sometimes very apparent when it comes to Saagar here, as what was pointed out here by Alan McLeod. They repeat State Department talking points. So keep that in mind if you want to keep listening to Saagar and Crystal. I'm just trying to look out for you guys, and also want to let you guys know that there's people out there that go deeper into these issues and that do not repeat State Department talking points in their analysis or in their articles. There's way better journalists and pundits out there by miles and miles and miles than Crystal Ball and Saagar and Jetty. Thank you guys very much for listening, and stay informed.